Hello everyone, and welcome to my YouTube channel. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Christine Rodriguez, and I have a podcast called Astrology Now Podcast where I post weekly. You can find my podcast on platforms like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, but it's available wherever you listen to podcasts. I think it's funny because people here on YouTube or people on Instagram, they tend to act surprised when they find out I have a podcast and this is my main thing. I post a podcast every week and I have since 2018. I think I've missed once. So if you're interested in weekly astrology, I do have it's audio only, but an audio podcast that y'all can listen to weekly. Of course, ever so often, I like to come here on YouTube to use visuals to talk about certain astrological events or, of course, research I've been working on. I love YouTube because there are visuals, and for people who are newer to astrology, it tends to really help encourage the educational process. And for those of you who are seasoned expert astrologers, maybe it provides a little bit more information and entertainment. So today I am wanting to talk about Mars and Ketu and this combination that we're going to experience from June 6th through July 28th. This is a big combination, okay? Now, I don't want to scare anybody. It's not my intention to come and fearmonger, but it is a truth of this universe that when catastrophe strikes, Mars and Ketu are often involved. Now, not every single time is there a catastrophe when Mars and Ketu come together, but when there is a catastrophe, a lot of the time Mars and Ketu can be culprits. So let's talk about Mars and Ketu and what they represent. First of all, in traditional astrology, Ketu is said to operate a lot like Mars. Mars is the planet of war, anger, violence, aggression. Now, on the positive end, Mars is heroicism, bravery, courage, athleticism, the will to get up and go, right? Athletes have a really strong Mars. Heroes have a really strong Mars. I think about Ram, Ram from the Ramayana. Now, Mars, of course, is also blood and muscles, which lends to athleticism. You'll see a lot of daredevils or people who seek adrenaline rushes with strong Mars. Mars, of course, is the ruler of Aries and Scorpio. But as I was mentioning, Mars is accidents, explosive behavior. It has to do with our anger and how we handle our anger and frustration. Now, Ketu, as mentioned, operates a lot like Mars in that it is explosive and it has a connection to accidents. Ketu is moksha karka, meaning it is the karka or the indicator of moksha, liberation, separation and freedom from this material realm. Now, we hear that and we like it in theory until Ketu starts taking things away from us. Right? Ketu is the great liberator. It's also the great separator. It takes us away from things of the material plane to orient us towards the divine. That can be quite unsettling, provocative, okay? Now, when Mars and Ketu come together, there can be some major issues that take place. So let's go ahead and take a trip down memory lane. On the day of 9/11/2001, when there was a horrific terror attack on the Twin Towers in New York, Mars and Ketu were conjoined. Now, Jupiter was also in ARDRA, which I want you to put a pin in. We're going to talk about it. Mars and Ketu were conjoined on the day of 9/11. Okay, it was an attack. It was brutal. It was a catastrophe. Now, when we look at 2020, at the beginning of 2020, around February, March, this is when globally the restrictions started rolling out. COVID became a much bigger deal. People started experiencing a lot more fear. Businesses started closing down, all sorts of stuff, right? When we look at March 12th of 2020, Ketu and Mars were conjoined. Okay? And so these are global events. These are things that have affected the global community. I'm going to go out on a limb and say I don't believe that June, July of 2025 is going to be as intense as these days, but I do believe there is going to be catastrophe and things that we need to watch out for. Okay, I'm going to save that until I get done talking about this, but again, let it be known that I believe between June and July there will be some type of an attack or accident, some type of big violent event. Now, more on a personal level, If you listen to my podcast, you know I love rock climbing. Rock climbing is like my other thing that I do that I love dearly. I've rock climbed since 2012, and so I'm very interested in the lore of rock climbing and alpinism. George Mallory and Andrew Irvine were two men who were attempting to make the first summit of Mount Everest, and this would have been in 1924. So before we had any gear or any fixed lines or anything like that, these two heroic, brave men were trying to summit Mount Everest. Now, they were last seen on June 8th of 1924, about 800 feet from the summit, and then some type of like haze or fog rolled in that covered the men on the mountain, and they were never seen again. They completely disappeared. It is concluded years later that they did die on that mountain. George Mallory's body was found. I don't think that they found Andrew Irvine, but they found George Mallory. He had a completely fractured leg. He 100% died on Mount Everest. Now, was that before or after the summit? We don't know. It's a mystery on if they were in fact the first men to summit Mount Everest. But anyway, on this day, on June 8th of 1924, Mars and Ketu were conjoined. On September 4th of 2006, catastrophe strikes again. There was a horrible accident with Steve Irwin and a Stingray. Absolutely tragic incident. I don't know what age y'all are or when you were born, but Steve Irwin was a hero of mine. I still believe he is an absolute icon. And when he died, I shed tears. When I think about it too much now, I cry. It's so sad to me. Now, on this day, on September 4th of 2006, Mars and Ketu were conjoined. So these are all events, right? These are global events. These are freak accidents. These are horrible things that happen. But when we look at the charts of people who have been in accidents or have had these crazy types of injuries, Mars and Ketu can be conjoined as well. I think of Marc-Andre Leclerc, who is also an icon in the climbing community. He tragically died in an avalanche on a descent, and he had Mars and Ketu conjoined in his birth chart. Now, Mars and Ketu, again, it can create a bravery, a courageousness, a daredevil personality. Not every time, but a lot of times you'll see it in a lot of athletes and rock climbers. So if you have this combination, please do not assume that you're going to be involved in some type of accident like this. I'm not trying to scare people. I'm just trying to demonstrate how the combination works. And so as we move through June and July, we need to be aware that there can be attacks, threats of attacks, explosions, planned or not, they could be accidental. We can see really violent events occur in the global community. Now, on a personal level, we need to be mindful in our own life of our anger, our aggression, how we're managing conflict, and of course, maybe accidents and injuries, especially if we partake in some of these high-risk activities. Now, I also want to say that in the outer world, we'll likely be seeing people act erratically, act aggressively, act without patience. So be extra careful on the road. Be very mindful. If someone is acting aggressively, don't add fuel to the fire willy-nilly. It's a great time to practice patience and taking time to react instead of just, knee-jerk responding. I should say take time to respond instead of react. And especially in our interpersonal relationships with the people who matter the most, giving them extra grace and being extra compassionate with them. Now, this combination of Mars and Ketu is taking place in the sign of Leo. So if you have planets in Leo, you need to be extra mindful. If you're running a Mars dasha, a Ketu dasha, be extra mindful. Leo moon, Leo ascendant, stelliums in Leo, things like that. And around the world, we could see issues with leaders, issues with kingdoms. Leo also has an association to children. It's the fifth sign of the fifth house. Entertainment, places of entertainment. So these are the things that we should be mindful of and the things to be looking out for. Now, some other combinations that I just want to kind of key you all in on is that Saturn and Neptune will also be in the same degree for a lot of this. We need to be mindful of issues involving oil and gas, issues involving water, maybe natural disasters. Neptune has an association to oil, gas, and water. Saturn has an association to crude oil as well. And so we need to be mindful of these things out in the world. And Neptune is illusions, whereas Saturn is reality. And so I think that this is going to be a time of a grand reality check. There may even be something involving health and wellness that comes up too. The final thing I'll say, the final transit I'll talk about is Jupiter in Gemini. Jupiter entered Gemini on May 14th. And if you listened to my podcast on Astrology Now, I was talking about how Jupiter in Gemini has an association to issues with travel. Planes, boats, cars. Historically, there have been a lot of issues involving transportation. Since May 14th, with Jupiter in Gemini, we've seen all of these issues with boats. Now, back to the 9/11 conversation, we were talking about Jupiter in ARDRA. Jupiter is the planet of abundance, grace, prosperity, opportunities. It expands and it grows. But Jupiter doesn't always grow things that we want it to. Jupiter is the planet that causes cancer and tumors because it causes things to grow, right? When Jupiter is in ARDRA, it expands the qualities of ARDRA. Now, for those of you that are unaware, ARDRA is an asterism in the sign of Gemini, okay? And ARDRA is associated to Rudra, the god of storms, the howler, the god of destruction. And when Jupiter moves through ARDRA, we tend to have pretty intense events. Now, Jupiter is going to be in ARDRA from June 13th until August 12th. So I want everyone to be aware of that. Now, I was having a conversation with my therapist recently, actually, Patricia, and we were talking about how as above, so below. When we have these astrological events, there can be a macrocosm and then there can be a microcosm in our personal lives. It makes sense that if we're having this collective heated energy, that we on a personal level, we can feel ourselves getting pulled into that. And so it's definitely my recommendation to be extra mindful of what you are allowing yourself to get pulled into and try to utilize whatever you experience for growth and evolution. So if you are feeling spicy and aggressive and assertive, how can that be an educational experience? How can that energy be utilized as a catalyst for good instead of detriment? So we may be feeling some of these things. We may be feeling more spicy, more Martian, more Ketu, whatever. But how can we utilize that to our advantage to improve our own life and the lives of those around us? If you would like to know how Mars and Ketu is going to influence your chart personally, you can sign up at patreon.com/astrologynowpodcast, where I do weekly horoscopes. My Instagram is astrologynow_podcast, and my website is innerknowing.yoga. My name is Christine Rodriguez. I'll see you all when I post on YouTube next.